All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out on the final day. I'm sure your brains are full with stuff. I know mine are. There's so much stuff happening. And at least today's a half day, so you'll kind of get going in the morning, then go relax in the afternoon. So my name is Ryan McMinn. I'm a program manager on the Access team at Microsoft. Before I joined Microsoft, I spent 6 years building Access applications for the enterprise, for everything from insurance companies to record labels. And a few years into that, we started to get more and more requests for web databases, web applications. And Access, while great for deploying and building quickly, didn't really fit into the web architecture. So we started looking at .NET and ended up kind of using Ruby on Rails for a few years. And although a lot of web frameworks make building web apps faster, it's not in any way compared to Access in terms of the speed and the agility and the ability to maintain and edit an application. With web apps, there's still a separation between the person that uses it and the person that builds it. And Access, I always felt, was a reconciling force between developers and users. It was one platform where a user could make an effect on the application by making a new report or a new query or a new form. And the developer had the flexibility through code and through the form designers to build advanced applications. And they could kind of meet in one place. I felt a lot of that got lost as we kind of moved to the web, where you're very disconnected and separate. And so we're excited to bring a lot of that back together now with Access and Access Services. So the focus of today's talk, the kind of key takeaways are, we built this service to run as a SharePoint Online hosted service. And what we mean by that is we built it so that it would scale out to hundreds of thousands of users, millions of sites. And the decisions we made around what we chose to support and what we chose to not support were really around maintaining a healthy SharePoint environment and making sure that, as one of the SharePoint tenets is, one bad site or one bad operation can't affect the whole farm negatively. And with Access, you have a lot of flexibility in querying and reporting and code. And so it was a challenge for us to bring that to SharePoint in a safe way, so that as a SharePoint admin, you can reliably install and run our service and not worry about someone building an application that's going to affect the service in a bad way. The other thing we really wanted to do is give SharePoint admins the operational insight and monitoring capabilities to understand and control how these applications are being used. And we wanted them to be codeless. One of the great advantages of Access, as I mentioned before, is it gives the ability for business users to edit and change and tweak things. And in SharePoint, when you're running code or deploying code, it's a high level of permissions. And we really want to lower that barrier. So in Access, the applications that we build don't require any code. You can deploy them on the server with designer permissions. Basically, if your users can create a team site, they can publish an Access application. If they're a contributor, they can run our code and workflows that we use. So how many people have come to a previous Access Services session this week? Oh, we got a decent amount. Okay. So I was going to do a kind of intro demo from scratch, but I'll just jump into it to show publish quickly for the people that haven't seen it yet. Should I switch to that? Yes, I will. That was the music I was playing earlier. All right, cool. Just make sure this is the way I expect it. Yeah, perfect. So this is the sales database that we built in the intro session. And I'm going to go ahead and publish that to SharePoint and just quickly talk through what that means and how that works. And then I'll kind of build on that for the rest of the session. So publishing is pretty easy. I can pick the server I want to publish to and give it a name. If I could spell. It's a little early for me still. 3. There we go. So in Access 2007, we allowed you the ability to publish your list to SharePoint and manage and control the data through SharePoint. In Access 2010, we're now letting you move your entire application to SharePoint. The forms, the queries, the reports, all get moved up and stored in SharePoint. And the forms can render and the reports can render in the browser. So in this database, we're moving all of our lists to SharePoint, all of our data into those lists. We're taking our forms and turning them into ASPX pages that run in the browser. Our reports get written to RDL and get rendered in the browser as SQL Server reports. Our queries go into our system table and are rendered through our query processor, which I'll go into in a little bit. And our UI macros, the macros we use to kind of navigate around the application, open forms, do special rules on forms, those get converted into JavaScript and run in the browser. And the more heavyweight logic, the business logic that lives at the data level, gets converted to SharePoint workflows and gets executed on the server. So we have server representations of all of these client objects. And this way your application will run and the client and the server in the same way. So let's go take a look at this application running in the browser. And again, there's a great fidelity between the two. And it's all standard HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There's no ActiveX or special controls. So this will render in Firefox and Safari as well as it does in Internet Explorer. And our UI macros allow us to navigate around the interface and have rich form experience as well as reports. I can click on. I can see that that information now updates. So I've got a great way to build simple departmental tracking applications, push them to the web, and utilize them. So that's kind of the user side of it. What today's talk really focuses around is the architecture behind the service. So one of the challenges we see from the admin side of SharePoint is it's very hard to manage the traffic, and you really have to rely on the throttles and the things in place and the architecture of a service to do that for you. You can't really direct traffic on a highway, which is sort of the idea of the slide. You really need measures and controls and kind of dials to tweak the experience in order to make sure that your server health stays up. So before you decide to roll out a brand new service, there are a bunch of questions that we've been asked a lot when we've kind of showed this around. One of them is, what's the system architecture? How does this work inside of SharePoint? What are the components? The second is the data platform robust enough for relational applications? Can you build the kind of applications that you couldn't access inside of SharePoint? What are the performance and security implications for my current system? When I deploy the service, what's going to happen? What things do I have to consider before I roll it out? And how do I secure the data and manage it? How do I monitor and manage the service and the apps and data that my users create? So once I've let them go out and start building these things, how do I kind of monitor them and manage them? And when it becomes popular, how do I scale it out? If I've got a large deployment and I want to service thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, how do I really scale the service out? Does it scale? And finally, how does a server get deployed? And how do my users end up using these applications? And we've got a couple cool things to show you in that part of it. So I wanted to start off with the architecture. And this is, well, it looks relatively complicated. It's the second least complicated slide that I have today. There's one more that's a little crazier. But basically, if you look at the top, we'll start from the top and work our way down. At the top, you really have the two clients for these applications. You have the Access client and then the web browser. And the Access client talks directly to our session service, which is based on Excel services that manages the session and authentication inside of SharePoint using standard SharePoint authentication. And the browser talks directly to the Dataform web part. So all of our forms and reports render inside the SharePoint Dataform web part. And all of our data sheets render through the project data sheet. So the project team built a great data sheet that I'm going to show you in a second with a larger set of data sample. All of those things talk to our session, and the session kind of manages the users logged in. Those data requests then go to the Access Services web service. So this is a middle-tier service, an application server that lives on top of SharePoint, much the same way that Excel calculation services lives on top of SharePoint today. And this service handles our query processor and our data access layer. So it lets you execute more complex queries than you could in SharePoint, as well as managing bringing the data in and out of SharePoint. I'll get into that in a little bit. And we also have a ADO.NET in-memory store. So when we get data out of SharePoint, we store it in this middle tier, and that's what you work against from the browser or the client. And then our ADS, or our web service layer, talks to the SharePoint list directly. And through those lists, gets access to the expressions, the validation, and a bunch of the data platform features. And then, as I mentioned before, our more advanced workflows, or our more advanced data macros, get converted into workflows. So on the server, we have a system table where we store the definition of all of your objects. And that system table has event receivers on it. So when you add new XML for a form, if you make an adjustment to a form, you add a field to it, you change a color, that XML gets updated in the system table, and our event receivers kick off and go generate you a new ASPX page. If you change your data macro, those same event receivers trigger and create a new workflow or quick flow for you. So we have a kind of system table that does all this generation, and you can edit in the client and seamlessly have it work. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the data platform. When we released 2007 and allowed you to push your data up to SharePoint, we had two key pieces of feedback. One of them was performance. When you got over the 2,000 record in SharePoint limit in terms of amount of items, you'd start to run into performance issues. The other challenge was the features that Access developers had come to rely on, like referential integrity, didn't exist inside of SharePoint. And they had to rewrite a lot of that in their middle layer in the application, and they didn't feel that it was robust enough to depend on. And this is a great quote from our blog, one of our users who had some comments about it. So we're really excited about SharePoint 2010 because all of these things are now there. And we've worked a lot with the SharePoint core team to help bring these things into the platform. So SharePoint now has list relationships where you can do restrict insert or cascade delete. It has unique column constraints, so you can look at a column and say, the data in this column must be unique. And it has data level validation, where you can put validation rules on a data level, whether it's on an item or on an overall list, and ensure that the data that goes into the database is exactly the data that you expect. And these features are different from the SharePoint validation features that are currently in the product, like required or min-max ranges, where they're only supported on the UI level and not at the web service or the OM. All of these features are at the data level. So if you're going through the web service or the OM or any way you access that SharePoint list, these will be respected. And for Access Services lists, we have a special flag that we add to the list that takes the existing SharePoint validation, like required field and min-max, and plumbs that all the way down to the data layer too, so that there's no way to get around the rules that you've set for your data. And we feel that's very important as a robust platform for developers. So the next thing I wanted to chat about was, what are the performance and security implications from our current system? So security, we're really all about leveraging SharePoint. Let me just slip to this part. One of the reasons we chose SharePoint as a platform is because it gives us a bunch of stuff out of the box, and security is one of those things. Since what we create when we publish an Access database to SharePoint is a subweb, and all of our stuff lives inside that subweb, we now get to leverage the SharePoint user and permissions model to allow you to share that application or parts of that application to users and make sure that only people that are allowed to see the data can see the data. We also get to leverage the great work SharePoint's done with claims authentication on the client and server. So whether you're in the Access client or on the server, all the authentication models work back and forth. So if you have a list that has a certain rule, that rule is going to be applied in the server or in the Access client, and you have to log in from both places using all the different options you have in SharePoint for claims. It also gives you centralized data storage, which we think is very important. It's one place to have all your data stored and managed and monitored, and SharePoint has a lot of things in place to help you do that. It also means that these databases are automatically part of the SharePoint backup and restore mechanism. Or you can do exports and imports through Prime. All the base SharePoint platform stuff applies to these sites, since they're standard SharePoint lists and standard SharePoint objects. And one of the other great advantages of SharePoint is the provisioning model. One of the challenges we had in previous releases when we made a bunch of investments in SQL was it's very hard for end users to create new SQL databases. In fact, in most organizations, it's highly discouraged to allow any user in the organization to just party on the SQL server. Where SharePoint, because it's a throttled environment and really built to support a multi-tenant system, it's really designed for, instead of one or two giant applications, thousands and thousands of smaller applications and sites and things like that. So it's very easy to allow users to create things in SharePoint, and often it's encouraged for them to go make their own team sites, their own lists, their own stuff to track things. And that model really works well for Access. All right, cool. So I'm going to show a quick demo. So one of the challenges we had with moving up to SharePoint is in Access, usually databases are 5,000, 20,000, 100,000 records. Where in SharePoint, a lot of the restrictions around lists start hitting you around the 5,000 record limit. So for example, in 2010, once you go over 5,000 records in a list, there's certain things you can't do anymore, like sorting and filtering inside of a data sheet. And that's because when requests go to the database that are over 5,000, it really blocks SQL and it can affect other people's users' access to that site. So we really wanted a way to allow our applications to go bigger, but in a safe and scalable way. And that's where, in the previous slide that had all the stuff on it, I showed you the middle tier application server, which I'll go into a bit more detail here. And what that does is it manages the communication between our application and the SharePoint content database. And in this case, we have a database that has 40,000 records. So I'm going to refresh this so I don't get any session issues. And I'm going to go, once it loads, to my data sheet. So this data sheet is requesting all of the records from order details, and there's 40,000 of them. And now it's gone to SharePoint and it's pulled those out. And how it does that is it pulls them out in 2,000 record chunks. 2,000 records gets under the SharePoint throttle limitation and makes sure that no other requests are getting blocked while you're doing that, and it keeps the farm up and running very stably. And what we do is we take those records and we chunk them together in an ADO.NET record set in the middle tier in memory. And so now you're working directly against that record set and not going back to the content database. So in this case, we can do some sorting and say, okay, we're going to sort by unit price. Great, that's nice and fast. And we're going to go product, and we're going to say, let's just go look at one product. Great. So we're sorting and filtering against the full 40,000 record set, but we're not going back to the content database. We're only going against the cache that we have in memory. And with this control, this is the project data grid, it also gives us a couple other great things for moving around large sets of data. One of them is, obviously, you don't need to bring all 40,000 records into the DOM in the browser. You crash it. So what we've done with the data grid is they do really smart paging. So as you scroll down, it'll go get the next set of records, and it's only ever showing you 200 at a time, the 200 that you can kind of look at once. So if I go down in the middle of this record, it'll just pop and load, and it's all loading in the background. So it's really dynamic. And it makes it much more snappy and responsive to move through large sets because you're only getting the data that you need to see at one time, even though all of the sorting and filtering operations will work against the entire set. And in the same way, we have a list view. So in Access, we have the sense of continuous forms, and we've brought that to the web as well. So in this case, you can see that we're looking at record 1 to 10 of 40,000, and we have thousands and thousands of pages of data. And it's very easy for me to go to the end of that record set or go anywhere arbitrarily in the middle. And the performance is pretty snappy. And that's because, again, we're not going back to the content database. We're really only going to this middle tier. So I actually have a couple slides that demonstrate this a little bit too, which I'll zip over to. Cool. So this is an example of the form rendering I just showed you, where we have the browser, the web front end, and ADS. ADS is our application server that runs the data. So when the browser makes the request to our web service will pick an ADS box using the health information to figure out which one to route it to. Now, I've got an example later on that shows a larger configuration, but you can have multiple access data services boxes in your deployment, and we'll automatically use the load balancing through Excel services to pick the right box to go to that has the least amount of load. So then we send that request through to ADS. ADS uses a workbook to store the session information in an Excel workbook. And then it runs that query against the content database. Now, one of the things we try to do here as well in order to increase performance is we try to push predicates down to the content database. So an example of that is if I have a query that's got all my customers all over the world, and in that query I put in the criteria, I only want to see Canada. I say Canada because I'm Canadian. So I only want Canada. I've got hundreds of thousands of records. When that request goes down through ADS, ADS will push that predicate down to the content database, and it'll only request the Canadian records back. So we do a bunch of optimizations in the query layer to try wherever we can to push those predicates down to reduce the load on the SharePoint content database and make sure we're only getting the information that we really need. So once we get the data back from the content DB, we stitch it up and we store it in memory. We then return the first 100 rows in the session ID to the WFE, render the data, and then return the HTML and session ID back to the browser. So that's the kind of map of how it works through. So that's the first request. That's when we're actually hitting the content database and getting data out. The next example is we've got the data in the cache. Now we're paging, we're sorting, we're filtering. So in this case, we send the same request up to the WFE. It's got our session ID, and our session ID and the session store will actually let it know which ADS box to route itself back to, so that we're reusing that cache. So it'll crack the session, it'll figure out which box to direct the request to. It'll request from ADS. ADS will pull the rows out of memory, and it'll send them back. And then the WFE will send that back to the browser. So this really gives you a kind of overview of how the data moves around the system. Anything else on this one? Oh, and of course we're going to apply the data to the DOM. So that's a kind of overview of how we get data in and out of SharePoint. The next thing I want to talk about is how do I monitor and manage the service and the apps and data that my users create. So we put a bunch of things in terms of admin features inside SharePoint. I'm going to show you a couple of them. So this is the central admin page. In addition to the SharePoint throttles, of which there are a few, around the amount of records you can query against. There's a max limit of records you can query against. And they have a number of records that constitute a large list. So out of the box, 5,000 records means a large list and has the throttles applied. As an admin, you could up that, depending on your configuration, much higher. But we put a bunch of settings in for you just for access services. So one of them is maximum columns per query. So you can control how many columns are in a query, which will help control performance. Also, maximum rows per query. And this is a very important metric to look at. You may have in SharePoint, in one of the access services websites, 1 million records, 1.5 million records. But it's important to control how much you're really looking at one particular time. Now, it's very rare, and I haven't really seen too many cases where you want to pull a form down or a data sheet down that has 1 million records right in it. Usually, you're going to parse that down to a much more manageable set, something you can actually work with. So in this case, base SharePoint has a 50,000 record limit. So that's the amount of records you can return in a query. So if your query returns 250,000 records, you'll get a notification through the UI that that's too expensive a query to run. So we're kind of trying to balance the worlds of giving you the flexibility to run large sets of data, but in a safe and responsible way. You can also, from here, control the maximum sources per query. So you can control how many lists can be part of one query. You can control the maximum calculated columns per query, because they have a performance impact as well as the maximum order by clauses per query, so the amount of order by clauses someone can have inside of a query. And you can control the outer joins as well as the maximum records per table. So maximum records per table is an interesting one, and it's a request that we've received from a bunch of larger IT organizations around where they view access fitting in the organization. And a lot of them have come back and said, we encourage and we like to have access development, but we want to be able to find the applications that are getting big and make sure that we have some insight into them, and we want to move them into either another platform or merge them into what IT runs and manages and is responsible for. So they really wanted a way to, say, put a limit on how big an application could get, and then once it got to that limit, they'd be able to go and look at it and they'd get a request for it. And this is what we've done with maximum records per table, and that by default, we'll have a maximum limit, and then if you can tweak that or adjust that, but that kind of gives you a ceiling for how big these applications should get. We also have a log table, so you can kind of control the settings for the log table, as well as a bunch of the issues around sessions. Maximum sessions per user, maximum duration, a bunch of kind of dials and knobs for you as a SharePoint administrator to tweak to help kind of control your environment and manage it. And if there's certain applications you want to give more preference to, you can kind of use this to do that. And along the way, if anyone has any questions, just throw your hand up, and I'll try to get to some questions as we go through as well. So.
Do you have screenshots of the things you were just telling us about? The log tables themselves?
Of the log tables themselves?
Or, I mean, the administrative area where we can see that information.
Yes, so I'll just zip back. So the question was, where can we see this information? So basically right now I'm in central admin. Oh, in the slide. I'm sorry about that. I wonder why I was getting some blank looks. I was like, what, am I doing something wrong? That makes much more sense. All right, well, this will be quicker. I'll just slowly scroll down, and there you go. Yeah, so it's not, a very sexy page. built up excitement for it. But this is all part of central admin, so I can kind of go through central admin and see all this stuff. Thanks for calling that out. That's going to negatively affected my review scores here. So, all right.
I wasn't sure if you're reading notes or what. So.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's the problem with not being able to. It's so wide here, I can't see the screen. So, cool. All right. So the next thing I want to chat a little bit about is scaling it out. So we kind of showed the architecture of it, but how do we kind of scale this out to a larger set of servers? And this is the big slide. So this is an example of the same slide I showed you before, except kind of broadened out to show how it would work in a larger environment. At the top, we have the browser, and that could just as easily be the Access client. And in this case, we're running multiple web front ends. And those web front ends contain our data view web part, our Access services, Ajax stuff. So all the pages that we showed you before, there's no page refreshes. We do all of our page navigation through Ajax and through JavaScript. And then we have a data source control, which is at the bottom of the WFE part. And the data source control is really the way that we talk back to ADS. And that's where the load balancer and proxy information comes in to let you know which request to send to which backend server. And then below that, you can have the ADS and reporting servers on their own boxes. And you can scale those boxes out too. So that gives you the ability to have multiple servers with all the cached information in the data in the query processor. And then underneath it, it all talks to one content database. So that's kind of a web farm example. And the next one is more around report server in particular. So for our reports, we leverage report server to render them. And report server in SharePoint 2010 now comes with a couple new features which are really great for Access services. One of them is their report viewer web part actually is shipped as part of SharePoint, or I think you can install it after SharePoint, but it's free, and allows you to actually use report server against SharePoint lists without having to have a full report server. So it's more integrated into SharePoint. So for a standalone deployment, you don't need to have a report server. Our reports will render through this web part that you can install, and it all runs through SharePoint. Once you start getting a lot of users using reports, you really want to scale it out a little more and have your own report server. It really makes a big difference in terms of the request going to the content DB to split it off. So in this case, the report server web part can be configured, and you can do this through central admin to say, talk to this report server instead of using the local mode. Through its own load balancer to talk to a reporting server that can either live in our ADS boxes or it can be on its own box. And it goes and talks separately to the report database. So this is an example of how you could scale that out in reporting server as well, to have multiple machines and really have more impact. So I'm going to go back to a couple demos. One of them is, how do I deploy the server and the application to my users? So the server is really deployed like any other application server, very much like Excel services, where when you install SharePoint Enterprise, the Enterprise CAL of it, it just is there by default, and you can turn it on. If you do a standalone installation, it'll just automatically turn on. If you do a farm installation as part of the farm installation settings, you can turn it on. And what it contains is our ADS application server that's running as a service. We also have a site collection feature that includes the code that we use to deploy applications, the publish code, as well as the code to upload to the solution gallery, which I'm going to show you in a second. And it also contains a site-level feature. So when we're creating that subweb, when we're saying publish my application, it's saying, great, SharePoint, go create a web with this particular site template. And that contains our system lists, our event receiver code, and all the kind of stuff we have in there, and applies it to that site. So one of the challenges we had, too, is we didn't want from the Access client to be the only way for people to be able to create these applications and use them. Because we end up creating a SharePoint subweb, we really wanted a way to start from inside SharePoint and leverage SharePoint. And if you only need to edit the application, change data, add new records, but not design it, you could do all of that in SharePoint without the Access client. And then when you need to do more heavy lifting, add a particular field, change a form, change a report, you can then go to the Access client to do that. So I'm going to go back and show you that in action. So I'm going to close down this database, and I will open up where's my backup? My backup. So we always create a backup before we publish, which is useful for the demos because we can just go back to that setting before. Great. So this is our sales campaign database. It says demo on it, but it's not my demo. This is better. Okay. Thank you. Please yell again if I do that. So I will step back 1 second. So I open up our sales campaign database, the same database we had before we published it. I'm going to save that out as an Access template. Call it. And I'll include the data for this one. So now we're saving it as an Access template. And this template you can use to send to someone. They can open it up in Access and they can run it. And that's all standard stuff we've always supported. What's new now is I can go to the SharePoint Solution Gallery. So I can go back to my main site here. I can go to Site Settings and my Solution Gallery. And now I can upload this into the Solution Gallery, the ActDT. So we put in a bunch of code to allow Access templates to be uploaded into SharePoint. So I can go to my Solutions chunk of the ribbon and upload a solution. And the one we just picked was in Templates. Sales Web Template. Great. So what we're doing there is we're actually uploading the ActDT, and our code wraps it inside a WSP. So now it's a standard WSP that's living inside the SharePoint Solution Gallery. And in order to use it, we can activate it. Great. So now when I go back to my main page, so we'll go back to Browse and go home. Now I'm a user in SharePoint. I may or may not have Access installed on my machine. For this purpose, it doesn't matter. I go to Site Actions, and I want to create a new site for my team. So when I create a new site, I get the new Soda Gallery, which is in Silverlight, which lets me browse and work with different applications. Now when I go in here and say, hey, I want to look up something for sales. Great. My Sales Web Template appears there. So now it's a solution that's inside of the Create experience in SharePoint. I can give it a name. And a URL. And now our code is executing to take that ActDT, open it up, and convert that into a SharePoint site. Basically invoking our Access Services features, putting all the right stuff into the table, and now it's instantiated that same database that we did from the client. All inside of SharePoint without requiring the Access client. And it's the same application as I had before, with the same logic, with all the same stuff. So now I have a very easy way to deploy my application out to my users and put it everywhere where SharePoint exists. And they can use this application and enter sales data and work with it all through the browser. And if I want to make a change to it, it's very simple. I can click Options, open an Access. And now this will sync it all down into Access. And the great advantage here is I can unplug my network cable. So it's created a local copy for me in the My Documents folder. And now I can open it up. So now I can take this database offline. I can unplug, I can go on a plane, I can work with it, I can add data. I can even change the design of forms and reports. Tables I can't because schema is live, but I can change a bunch of my objects. And when I plug back in again, it'll automatically sync and manage conflicts for me and sync up to the server. So it's a great way to get your application running as in the browser, in the client, and offline as well. So if I was to make a change to this and say I'll do something simple that has sort of visual appeal and change the colors of it. And now I can sync back to the server. We didn't like that. Let's see if it made the change or not. I hadn't done that part before. This was probably some little issue I made. But that's the basic idea. You can kind of take it from all those angles and get it in. So we're really excited about the ability inside of SharePoint to really deploy the applications without having the Access client. And it gives you a much better reach and an integration into SharePoint that we think is really important. So the next thing is I want to bring up one of our customers, one of our top customers, to show a solution they built on top of SharePoint and show how you can take an Access application and extend it a little bit using some event receivers and integrate it into the greater kind of SharePoint environment. So welcome up Annie and Richard from Black Marble. Thanks. Get your mics on. Oh, Robert, yeah, sorry. Sorry, it's Robert, not Richard. It's my fault. All right, so I'm going to open up this for you. Cool.
Good morning, everyone. So one of the key things for us is we're an SI in the UK, and all the stuff that Access Services do, I mean, you've seen the talks, it's all very cool and very nice. What we need is a platform to actually deliver applications on, because a lot of this is all still bound within Access. The reporting great, the tooling's great, it is a great product. But typically, I mean, how many of you actually build sort of across-the-board SharePoint-style applications? Most of you? Yeah? Okay. Typically, you'll find that you actually build fairly structured data in SharePoint and build applications on top. But if you're starting to deploy to lots and lots of different customers like we do, while customers in the same field, whether it's police or fire or any of the blue light services, you might expect one fire service to need the same data as another. They're all very, very different. But the actual application piece tends to be the same. And what we needed from something like Access Services, which it delivers in spades, is an ability to have a flexible data layer with a fairly rigid application layer on top. So we're going to give you an example of one of the sort of accelerators that we deliver. This is a prototype for 2010. As we've gone around a lot of customers in time, we found in my sites people use the skills area to find other colleagues all the time. And certainly one of our customers, just by implementing SharePoint, was able to offset the entire cost of SharePoint, its installation and customization, just by having all of their consultants use my site to track which skills they had, so they could use internal people instead of external people for skills. They had 15 offices, and they needed somebody who could do quantity surveying for tower blocks, for example. And they had to hire somebody in the northern office, but the southern office had 3 people who could do that for the price of a train ticket, not $1,000 per day. However, when you're inside a lot of services, if I was working in a hospital, while you would trust me, because I'm a very trustworthy sort of person, if I put down that I'm a brain surgeon, I'm fairly confident none of you would want me to do brain surgery on you. So there's actually a very solid need inside most organizations not to allow people to say what skills they've got, but to actually have validated skills across the organization based on a solid skills taxonomy. Okay? So we're going to give you a quick example of that, and then I'll do five minutes at the end to talk about what you should be doing with Access and why is it a good tool set. So I'll actually just hand over to Andy. I think we want D.
It's D, yeah. Perfect.
Okay. Right, so we've written a little Access Services application. I'm going to start off in Access. We've seen a lot of this already this morning. Ryan's shown us quite a lot of this. So I'll sort of skip through here fairly quickly, but I just want to show you a few of the components that we've used to build our application in Access. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the server side of things in a moment. So obviously we've got things like tables. We've got a table here of users, and you'll notice that that's pre-populated. Now, in fact, that's because we've pulled some data from the server, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in a moment. But obviously, very easy to design. We've got all these standard tools in Access that we can go ahead and use. We've got forms. So here we have a qualification skills editor. Now, in fact, Access has actually put this together for us based on the tables and the relationships between the tables that we have defined within our application. And Access has made a great job of that for us. There's very little work had to go into that form to actually do anything further. So across the top here, we have the main area of the form. And we've got a sub-form that's been built from that relationship. So Access understands those relationships between the tables, between those items of data that we need, and is quite happy building us a set of forms like this. We can also produce reports. So, for example, here is a report on the data that we have at the moment. So there's a person's name down the left-hand side. We've got some skills. The date the skills acquired. And then you'll see just appearing down at the bottom over here, we've got an expiry date for a skill. So you might have skills that expire. Robert's just mentioned brain surgery. Perhaps you need to be recertificated for that every 10 years or something. So you can have a skill that expires, so you don't want it published anymore. You don't want it to be available until somebody's provided you with evidence that they've done the necessary training to make sure that, in fact, you can trust them to be a brain surgeon again. We've also got a navigation form that we've put together. Ryan's shown one of these, so again, nothing particularly out of the ordinary. And we can go through these and we can look at the various forms that we've put together. We can look at the reports and that sort of thing. We've got an extra tab at the end here called Sync. And this is where we've done a bit of extra work. So this is where our event receiver hooks into effectively within the Access Services items that we have here. So we've got two buttons here, import users and publish skills. Obviously, they do what they say. One imports the users that we have on SharePoint back into our database, and the other one publishes those skills that we've actually just detailed for those users out. Now, we've set the demo up today as if somebody here was an HR manager. They want to go through those skills. They want to sort out what skills everybody has, and so on, before actually pushing those skills out to the server. So they'll do their chunk of work, and then they can sync that up. Obviously, this could be completely automatic as the skill set changes and expiry date is reached and that sort of thing. All of this could be triggered automatically with no problem at all. But we've decided to do it manually today just because it's a little bit easier to show for you guys. So Ryan's mentioned recently publishing this. Obviously, we can publish that database application up to SharePoint very, very easily. And we can also synchronize all the data that we've got there as well. I won't do it at the moment just because it takes a few moments and we obviously want to move on. But the end user can work in Access or they can work on the web quite happily with all of this data, synchronizing in both directions without any problems at all. So if we now go and have a look on, sorry, wrong thing to minimize. If we go and have a quick look, we've obviously published this database up. And when it loads in just a moment, we should see that we've got a skills tracker Access Services application sat here. And there we go. As Ryan's just demonstrated, we've obviously got the forms that we've seen. This navigation form is obviously the user interface that we're using now to actually look at this lot. And in the same way as we've seen a moment ago, we can load various forms and so on and manage that data on the server more than happily. It's absolutely no problem at all. So this is just taking a moment or two to load. I'm afraid this is not the fastest machine on the planet. I'm sure it'll get there in a moment. Maybe. Okay, we'll come back and look at that in a minute if anybody wants to. But effectively what we get is exactly the same forms as we had on Access. So we can manage things in exactly the same way as we were doing before. Now we're on the server. These two buttons sort of perhaps are making a little bit more sense. Okay, we're on a server. We know we've got users sat on that server, and we obviously want to publish skills as well. So I'm just going to temporarily borrow the My site of our engineering director, Richard Fennell, and I'm going to show you that if we have a look at his profile on this particular machine.
I think it's him.
And have a look down here. The skills section down here is empty. Okay, there's no skills down there whatsoever. Nothing's been published in there. Richard's not entered anything. Okay, so that's empty. That's blank. So if we go ahead and publish the skills that we've got, you saw a report earlier in Access of what skills were applied to what person. And I'm going to bring debug view up in a moment as well, so we can have a quick look at what's happening. For this demo, we've put a lot more logging in so that we can actually see what's happening as we go through. So if I hit Publish Skills, that's going to kick off the workflow that's running in the background. And there we go, we've got the little processing logo coming up. The screen goes dark, so we know that the server's doing something for us, which is always nice. And hopefully in a few moments, we should actually start seeing some data coming past on debug view as well. So if we can just give this a moment or two. There we go, starting to process. There we go. So there we go. You can see at the bottom we're starting to actually process skills for people. We're getting skills for username and having a look through that lot. So there we go. So for Richard Fennell, skills are being published quite happily. And there we go. It's done. So if we want to just have a very quick look back through this debug view here, we'll see that it's actually gone through and processed. There we go. Cannot find user, SP2010 dev Fred. That's a user who hasn't logged in yet, so he hasn't got a profile created. So we can gracefully fail back on that and say, the skills database, yeah, we've got skills for this guy, but because he hasn't created a profile, we can't actually publish those skills out, so we can do that quite easily. But there you go. You can see the list of skills being published out to various sites and so on. And if we go back to Richard's My site and just refresh that a moment, what we should see is recent activity here, updated profile, and if we click more information, there we go, the skills has been populated. And if we now come back and refresh the page here, we should see, finishes loading, there we go, the skills are now being published. I'm going to hand back to Robert now, who's going to explain how all of that hangs together.
Good.
I'm standing very still because I'm making the popping sound. Can everyone still hear me?
Is your mic on still?
I think so. It's a dicky connection. No.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, yeah.
I'll use Andy's. Let's hope for the best. Can you all hear me okay? There you go. Technical issue. Okay, so a fairly straightforward, simple demo. Quickly run through how it goes. We upload from the Access client up into Access Services. You've seen that a bunch of times. We then install a SharePoint feature that provides custom event receivers. And this is the key to doing most of your Access extensibility work. Produce some event receivers that actually monitor the data to see when changes are going to occur, and that's where you actually do most of your work. They're very straightforward to produce. There's plenty of sessions, and if you've missed them, hit some of the recordings. Fairly straightforward to do. As Andy showed, we can then import the list of users from the user profile, which is, again, in the new object models, very quick to do. And then all we actually do is when any of our SharePoint lists or editing happens, the event receiver monitors for any changes and then just updates the user profile as necessary. And then the publish skills are seen. It is a very straightforward model of actually doing delivery. So what I'd actually urge you to do is, as you look at Access Services, our view is Access Services allows you to do about 80% of your heavy lifting for data work, compared to how SharePoint was before. You're still going to have to do custom work. If you actually want to build sort of SharePoint-style applications, there's a bit of work to do. One of the key things for us is, many of you have, if you're sitting in the Access world, will have looked at various RAD tools after time. And our view is that most RAD tools, you hit a barrier. And when you hit that barrier, you basically throw everything away and start again. What Access Services give you is as soon as you want to actually break out of Access Services, the extensibility is just standard SharePoint development. You don't actually hit that barrier. You just continue developing in SharePoint as you would normally, but you take away 80% of that data work. Access Services also allows you to get a client view in early to make sure your data is working, whereas traditional SharePoint development, that's not the case. You show them the end product as you would normal development. There's the tooling in Access and the reporting and that sort of thing are all great. There's two pieces I want to leave you with. The first one isn't a knock at our guys, but when you've seen all of the samples and you see people building samples and you see them use the little world symbol on the Access DB, it only takes one person with one erroneous click to not click one of the buttons with a world symbol, and you're in weeks of pain. That's just a top tip from us. I think there's just a top tip. I want to leave you with a very, very short anecdote, hopefully, about an experience that happened to me years and years ago. Now, I'm a deep dev, and I was at a party with people. I was a C++ developer at the time, and I was talking to somebody who turns out to be a VB developer. And this was years and years ago. And I dutifully laughed. And so he gave me an example and said, well, how long would this kind of project take you? And I think it was 20 days was my estimate. And he said, well, in VB it would take me 1. And I said, yes, but mine would have clever objects and all sorts of memory mapping. And he said, yes, but we get paid the same amount of money to do the same amount of work, right? So I just get paid 20 times as much as you. And it was my change into RAD tooling where I realized that he was right. And I said, yes, but I'm doing all of this clever stuff. And he said, but I'm relying on the Visual Basic team to be better than me and actually deliver a better tooling set. And I think the same analogy can be drawn exactly the same to Access Services and data work, that you're going to find a lot of people who'll say, yes, but it's Access. All you have to remember is that you're going to be delivering solutions upwards of 5 to 20 times faster, and you'll get paid exactly the same amount of money as they do for delivering their handcrafted solution, and you can go home and have some drinks. So hopefully you found this vaguely useful. I mean, we're just trying to give you an overview of why we're using Access Services and how useful we found it. I hope you find it as useful, and if you want to have a chat, please have a chat at the end.
Great. Thanks for coming up, guys. They can say all the things I'm not supposed to say, so that's good. All right, cool. So I think in quick summary, I'll go back to the slides here quickly. Oh, well, we'll leave this up while I talk for a second. So I think kind of the goal of today's session was to show you how Access Services can leverage a standard SharePoint service deployment, administration, and security. How we build an application server to process large sets of data in a safe and scalable way. And finally, how the service can scale out to match the requirements of your environment, and how easy it is for users to deploy these kinds of apps. And with the Black Marble demo, you can really see how you can start to extend those apps and kind of take them to the next level. One of the big bets we made was standard SharePoint objects. We use standard SharePoint workflows, standard SharePoint lists, and standard SharePoint document library models for ASPX pages and reporting server. And a lot of that was we see the future, and that is leveraging those things and having better connectivity with other tooling systems. And so we really feel like we've built the foundation. So thanks a lot for coming, and if you have any questions, just step up to the mic or yell it out, and I'll repeat it. Thanks a lot.
Good morning. How do you handle in this distributed world, once you've distributed the content, let's say in our case to our mobile sales team, they do various updates. How do we handle update contention? Two people attempting to update the same record, they update completely different information or the same information, but they, for example, name change, something really simple, and then we come back. We have some systems we use internally.
So you have the same conflict management you have with SharePoint lists. They're just standard SharePoint lists.
Same way.
Same way. Exactly the same way. And the Access client talks to SharePoint through the standard web services, so the same rules to the SharePoint list applies regardless.
Last question. Once you've imported this Access structure into Access Services, will we be seeing any, what are the admin tools like in terms of changing the structure, adding columns, altering the schema?
So basically the question was, once I've got the application published, how do I iterate on it and work with it and add schema? And you can do all of that inside the Access client. So in this case, here, go back here. If I open this up in the Access client and it's now a web application, if I want to add a field, I can just open it up, go to the end, and add schema right there. And that'll automatically add the schema up into SharePoint. So you can continue to build on, iterate, and work with your application inside the Access client and sync it up to the server and keep working with it. You can also in Access link to any SharePoint Foundation list, not ecal, the full Foundation list, and you can edit the schema of that list. So Access becomes a great way to quickly build up SharePoint tables, as you can link to any SharePoint list and start iterating on adding it to it as well.